So to figure out the length of the plates of this final wall, it's pretty simple. Because I've nailed down the walls here, the bottoms of these walls won't move anywhere. It's real simple. All I have to do is just basically butt my tape measure in and measure up to the other wall. I see 89 and a 16th, 89 and an 1/8 almost. So I'm going to make these two plates 89 inches. So when I go to lay this wall out, the only thing that's going to be a little bit different is the on-center layout. So because that very first wall, that back wall here, ran long all the way to the outside of the structure, notice how this one's actually running short. It runs short and it butts up against this wall. So when I do my layout, I actually have to accommodate for the thickness of this wall. So what I'm going to do is I'm holding my tape measure over 3.5 inches, and then I will mark my 15 1/4. And all that does is just allows me to accommodate for the thickness of the wall there. Now, because there's a doorway going in here, what I need to do is I need to actually figure out where center of this this wall is, because I'm going to center a 5-foot door in this opening. So 4 feet. So all I did there was I hooked on the wall on that side. I measured over 4 feet, made a mark. I did the same thing, measured from my left to the right, and it gave me a 4-foot mark there. Because they weren't the exact same point, all I did was I put a center line on there, and that now becomes my center point. Then what I'm going to do is, because I want a 5-foot door, what I do with my tape is I want to center the 5-foot door. So I take the 5 feet, if it was a number that was very hard to center, I take my tape, I line it up with 5 feet like that, and I can sight to the center of my tape, and it'll give me a general idea of where center is, or what half of 5 feet is. So I guessed that half of 5 feet was 30 inches. So what I'll do is I'll stick 30 inches on that center point, mark the end of my tape, and then what I do is I can put 30 inches on my mark, and I measure over to my center point, and I can see that 30 is exactly half of 5 feet. So what I'm going to do here on the end here is I'm actually going to put what we call a jack stud. So I like to mark my jack studs with O's. And then what I'm also going to do is I'm going to measure over 1.5 inches, and I'm going to square across another line, and that's going to be what we call a king stud. So when I start building this wall, I'll show you the difference between these two studs. But basically this jack stud here is the furthest in stud to the opening, and it actually will hold up what we call a header above the opening, and it holds all the strength in the wall that rests down on top of this opening. So I got my O and then my X, and now because this is such a close space to the previous stud, I would then use my king stud spacing for where I'm going to actually locate this stud. So therefore, this stud here in the wall is only in the end, as well as I'm going to continue with cripple studs above this header. So hold 3.5. There. Alright, so what I've got here is I've got the very front wall. What I've done is I've got the king studs in. So the king studs are the full length studs that go on the outside of the entire rough opening. Now, what I've got here is actually my header material. So for this, we're going to use 2-ply 2x6. So I've already cut them to length, and the length of it is 5'3". And the reason why I can figure that out without even pulling out a tape measure is I know that the rough opening that I spaced is 5 feet. Now, what ends up happening is this header actually has to sit on top of the jack on either side. And I know that the jack on either side is 1.5 inches thick. So if I add 1.5 inches to each side, I'm adding 3 inches in total. So then the header material should be 5'3". So that's what these are made to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to nail these 2x6s together. So these boards here on the top, it's a little hard to see, but they're actually not 100% flush with one another. When making a header like this, you want to make sure that they're perfectly flush here. So one of the ways that I can actually go about achieving this is I nail the two ends. That way the two ends are secure. They won't move at all. Then what I can do is on the top edge of the board, what I'll do is I'll actually toe nail the board towards the other board. And I know this is very slight. So what I'll do is I'll toe nail it on edge like that. And then what I'll do is I'll take my hammer and I'll hit that head of the nail. And because the nails I use are all spiraled like this, what happens is as that nail goes in, it'll actually kind of act like a screw and it'll pull the other board right down to it. So just by hitting it twice, you can already see that this board is now higher than the board I just hit. So I've already over hit it. So all I have to do is just kind of tap it back and it helps hold it in place. I want to make sure it's nice and flush there. And then what I can do is continue nailing it just like through the face like I did on the ends. So next what I'm going to do with this header is I'm going to install it, and there's a few different ways to install it, but the way I like to do it is I always like to keep it flush to the top of the wall. Notice how, since this is the front face of the wall, I'm making sure that everything is flush to the front. So again, notice how this is not flush here. There's actually quite a bit of a lip there. I'm going to do the same technique here. I'm even going to pull up a little bit on the 2x6, nail on the angle, and then hit it. If it needs a little bit more, you can always fire another nail in. You can see that I've already gotten it pretty close. I may throw one more nail in just to be safe. There we go, perfectly flush. Now I can nail it off. So now, what I need to do is I actually need to accurately cut the jacks that are going to fit underneath this header. The best way to do this with a pre-cut stud is if I know the size of the header I'm using, I can just take and measure that off of a regular stud. So with a 2x6, 2x6s are 5.5 inches tall. So on a 92 5/8 stud, all I'm going to do is mark 5.5 inches, and then that's going to be my cut, and that's how I figure out my my jack size. So with these jacks here, the most important thing with the jack is it absolutely cannot be cut in any shape, way, or form. It has to be one continuous board that runs from the underside of header all the way down to the bottom plate of your wall. So then next what I have to do, once the top and bottom of my jack have been nailed, what I want to do is I want to make sure that the jack is nailed to the king stud. So what I try to do is I try to do 2 nails around knee height, middle, and then head height up at the top there. So if by using your nails has not tightened the gap up, I would suggest using your hammer and hit the nails right where the heads are, and that'll help tighten everything up. Okay, so what I'm doing right now is because I install my header tight up to the top of the wall, what I need to do is I actually need to frame it down to the top of the rough opening for the door that's going to go in here. So what I did is I hooked on, and we're looking for a 78 inch rough opening for the doorway. So what I did is I marked 78 inches. And I also marked 79.5, and that's to allow for a rough sill plate to sit just like that. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to cut blocks that are going to come down from the header down to that point all the way across this header here. And then once those blocks are installed, I can then install my bottom rough sill plate. So typically what ends up happening is I will leave this plate here full length all the way across, and I will stand the wall, and what it'll do is it'll allow me to hold the wall from moving in and out through the doorway. But because it's the width of the doorway, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut it out and I'm going to utilize it as my rough sill above the doorway. So all I'm doing here is earlier when I laid out the whole wall, I actually transferred over the on-center layout so that they actually line up with the studs in behind. And all I'm going to do is I'm just transferring that line all the way down to the header so that I can install these blocks up underneath the header like this. Next, what I'm going to do too is rather than trying to pull my tape out and relay out my top plate, all I'm going to do is I'm going to line it up with my jack lines here. I'm just going to transfer over the lines. And then it's just a matter of I take it, stuff it underneath here. So notice how I actually have a gap on the left-hand side. So I nailed the rough sill on the right-hand side. And what I'm doing here is I'm actually going to truss my measurement. So what I have to do is I actually have to pull the whole doorway in until it's nice and tight, just like that. And I'm going to nail it. And what that'll do is it'll help hold the door on its proper measurement, which will help for installation of door later. Cool. I think this one's ready to go up. So now we've got all the walls kind of tied together. All the corners are all nailed properly. Next, what we have to do is we actually have to make sure all of these walls are properly braced before we start sheeting them. So what I mean by that is, take a look at this. Because this plywood's on this wall, this does not want to move side to side. Whereas a wall like this, because there's no plywood on here, Look at how easily I can move this. It's really easy. So in order to actually install this properly, we need to make sure that the wall is not leaning one way or another. So what we're going to do is I'm going to put a temporary brace on it with the assistance of Mitch. We're going to make sure that these corners are perfectly plumb, and once they are, we can then start installing all of our sheathing on the outside. One of the ways that we can go about plumbing our walls is using something called a plumb bob laser. Basically what this is doing is it's actually shooting a little tiny dot, a little laser below, and it's shooting it also above. And wherever this line is, means that it's perfectly plumb. So what I like to do is I like to have it so that it hits just on the edge of the 2x4 below. And then when we look up at the top, you can see that the wall actually has to move out in order to have the laser just on the end. So what I've done is at the top of this brace here, I've put an angled brace. I've already tacked it with 2 nails. Mitch is going to push the wall out for me. You can push it out now, Mitch. And he's going to hold it so that the laser just touches the edge. Once it does, I'm going to come to the bottom of this plate here, and I'm going to tack it. So therefore, it'll hold it all in place. Still good?
Yep.
All right, let go. All right, so a different way of going about this is using a 4-foot level. So what Mitch is doing right now is he's looking at the level on the last stud in the wall. And what he's done is he's placed it roughly center of that stud, and he's trying to align it so that the bubble is between those 2 lines at the very top of the level. Once he has it set, I can then tack this at the bottom and hold everything in place. So how are we looking, Mitch?
Looks pretty level.
Okay. You can let go, it's still good?
Yep.
Cool. What I've done here is I didn't have a piece of material that was long enough to run from the top plate all the way down to the bottom plate. So the reason why we need to go from top plate to bottom plate is because if I were to attach to one of these guys, look at how much they move. Whereas the bottom plate, it's a fixed, secure spot. So if I'm bracing a top which is not going to move down to the bottom which is not going to move, it'll really stop the whole wall from wanting to go side to side. Okay, so now these walls won't move in any way. Like I can shake this and I don't feel any movement. So now what I can do is I can start going and nailing on sheets of plywood on the outside of these walls to hold them nice and straight so that we can take these off. Okay, so if you're working by yourself, this is something that I can do on my own. I know sheets are a little bit awkward to carry. But what I like to do is I actually will set myself a nail here on either end to allow me to rest a sheet on top of it. Now when I put these nails in, I want to make sure that they're in enough that it's not going to fall on me and hurt me. But all I did to do this is I hooked on the very first plate. So in between those plates, I measured down 48 inches, which is the height of this sheet, 48 inches. So therefore, I can rest the sheet on top of this and tack it in place enough for me to be able to pull these nails and walk away and grab my next sheet. Actually, what I'm going to end up doing is I might leave these nails in to allow me to have like a spacer between my my sheets. It's actually kind of a good thing to have a slight space between these sheets, just because these do expand and contract a little bit, so it allows it to have a little bit of that space in between. Okay, so in the corner here, the reason why I left the sheets off of the 3 walls is so that whenever I had a wall that was short, so you see how the plate here, we built this wall to fit between the 2 walls. What I wanted to do with the plywood is I wanted to overlap the plywood onto the other wall. That way I can nail into this stud here from the side wall, as well as into the stud of the inside wall. That just helps hold all the corners in nice. It just really locks it all together. So the doorway is actually in behind here. Now, sometimes I find it easier to cut it when it's already up. However, you don't have to do this. So one of the ways that I do it is I'll stand it up, and then what I do is in behind the plywood, I send my tape up until it butts against that rough sill plate up there. I read 30 and 3/8. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna mark 30 and 5/8. And with plywood, I tend to cut a little bit larger with plywood just because it doesn't have to be as pretty, but at the same time, you can still make it pretty, but it's always better to have plywood back a little bit from the framing rather than overhanging the framing. 18. So if you don't feel comfortable scribing, you can always use a chalk line, or you can just use plain straight edge. So all I did to figure out this cut here is I hook on the end of the plywood. I measure up to the wall. I've got 17 3/4. So up near that scribe line, I'm gonna mark 17 3/4. And using my chalk line, I hook on the bottom here. I go right on up to the mark I made, and stamp my line. And hopefully when I cut that out, everything is perfect. So once you have the opening cut out, you do need to nail into that leading edge there. That way it doesn't kind of rattle around. And all I was doing there is I was making sure to nail into those cripple studs that I built previously. To define those, all I was doing is I was looking at the nails underneath. And I saw that the nails were in line with the black line, so I just followed them up as high as I could reach. So what I'm gonna do afterwards is when I'm up on the, doing the roof, I'm just gonna reach over and I'm gonna nail off that last little bit of the wall that I couldn't reach from the ground floor. So when cutting plywood, sometimes I find it a little easier to do this while I'm cutting to allow me to cut a straighter line. So previously I had mentioned that all I'm really doing is I'm looking at the blade while I cut. Now, when I cut plywood, because I'm cutting a really long line, what I'm actually doing is I'm lining up with the chalk line with the blade. Once I have the blade started, all I'm doing is I'm looking at the front here, and you see at the front there's actually a 0 line. And that 0 line is actually representing the front of the blade. So it's kind of similar to driving a car. You never want to look straight down at where you are. You always want to look off in the distance to allow yourself to go straight. So that's kind of the same concept here, just with a skill saw. Okay. That's pretty much all I can do today.
Okay, we've got about as far as we can get today. Thank you very much for your help again, Alex. We'll be back tomorrow to start the roof, so join us for the next video.